Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dal, and Season 3 content is arriving through War Within in just a handful of days, but right before we finally get into seasonal content with the delves, PvP, raids, and dungeons, we do have a couple last-minute class changes on the horizon, though I wouldn't be surprised if they continue to do a little bit of tuning over the next few weeks as soon as Season 3 drops. For this new set of patch notes that will be arriving for this weekly reset, Tuesday for NA, Wednesday for EU, and with this set of new class changes, we got some more adjustments, taking basically any spec that is overperforming and toning them down a little, but also anybody that is underperforming and bringing them up a notch. And there's adjustments both for PvE content as well as PvP content as well. To make it easier for you guys to get to the changes you care about the most, I am going to have chapter marks down below so you can skip around to the different sections for any classes that you're interested in the most. But with that being said, as always, if you guys want to keep up with regular class changes, patch notes, or any new updates regarding patch 11.2, be sure to follow the channel and subscribe. But otherwise, let's dive right in. The first class to receive some buffs will actually be Druids, with Balanced Druid as the first spec for us to take a look at. First of all, they're buffing the aura for Balanced Druid, which buffs all the damage they do by 8% for this update. They've already gotten an 8% aura buff like a week ago with the patch 11.2 launch, but they're getting yet another one. Hard to tell if this is going to be enough to bring Boomkins to shape to the rest of the classes, but it at least helps them compared to the current position, which has been a little bit unfavorable. They also are doing a bit of tuning between the tier sets, which are going to be Keeper of the Grove and Alliance Chosen. As part of the Keeper of the Grove tier set, part of the bonus is whenever you pop your major cooldowns, you also get to summon a Dryad. By herself, she does quite a decent bit of damage with Star Charges as well as a Starfall, and she also is able to accumulate a portion of all the damage you do into a buff called Dryad's Favor, which then afterwards allows your next Star Surge to then cleave multiple targets. So the more damage you are able to accumulate towards a Star Surge, the harder it's going to hit, but it's also going to have a cleave mechanic at the same time. They are buffing up the Dryad's Favor mechanic in order to make sure that it's able to accumulate even more damage from all of your abilities. Able to accumulate it a little bit faster, accumulating 3% of all damage done instead of 2%. And now the Dryad's Favor buff is capped at 10 times spell power instead of 6 times spell power. And the splash damage, however, has been lowered down a little bit. So instead of splashing down for 20% of that damage to nearby targets, it is now splashing for 15% damage to nearby targets. So quite a bit of decent improvement overall. But by itself, these changes may not be enough to keep Keeper of the Grove somewhat competitive, as it looks like Alliance Chosen over the past few weeks in PTR really has taken over. So they're toning that one down quite a decent bit. First of all, the 2 set is being toned down, where the Starfire's damage bonus is being reduced down to 20%. It has now a 40% chance to launch a Star Surge that is now going to be at 45% effectiveness. So toning down the chances, the damage, as well as the proc damage of those additional Star Surges. And they're also reducing down the 4 set, where the Star Surges that are able to cleave damage to multiple targets, instead of being able to cleave it at 80% effectiveness, it is now going to be reduced down to 40% effectiveness. What this change does is it tries to at least level out Balanced Druid so they're not forced to play Alliance Chosen within raid content, where normally Alliance Chosen is generally set up better for AoE damage, while Keeper of the Grove, at least over the past few seasons, was historically set up as a single target playstyle. And I think what they're trying to do with this change is just try to give Balanced Druids a little bit more options between Alliance Chosen and Keeper of the Grove, instead of just being stuck for Alliance Chosen for the entirety of Season 3. And outside of Balanced Druid, we also get some changes for Restoration. Specifically, Restoration playing Wildstalker on PTR found there was a bug that caused the tier set to be a little bit overinflated in value. The tier set itself wasn't strong, but the bug interaction allowed it to be stronger than what it was supposed to be. So they ended up fixing any bugs within the tier set and its interactions that were observed during PTR testing over the past few weeks. However, because of this, Wildstalker Resto is being made weaker because the bug interaction no longer applies, so they're having to buff up the tier set a little bit. The Wildstalker Bloom and Growth Healing is now being buffed up by 15%, so it should make the playstyle of the buff Wildstalker baseline playstyle just a little bit stronger overall. As for the tier set itself, they're also buffing that up as well. The true set is now going to have an increased rate at which symbiotic blooms grow, increasing it from 30% bonus to a 45% bonus, while the Foresight will now cause Symbiotic Bloom healing to have a 35% chance instead of a 20% chance to trigger a bursting growth at 100% effectiveness instead of 80% effectiveness. So overall, a buff for Wildstalker Restoration Druids, which should hopefully give them some sort of a competitive value going forward now that those bugs that cause them to be overtuned are fixed. Lastly, we have a small change for Feral Druids within PvP specifically, though it's not really that small. They're essentially getting an 8% damage nerf all across the board. Yeah, so just a straight up nerf for Feral Druids right before Season 3 launches for PvP content. Next we have the class of Death Knight, which are getting primarily PvP changes. For Frost Death Knights, we're receiving a nerf to Frost Strike, reducing its damage by 15%. As well as a spec of Unholy, we're receiving Festering Wound damage reduced by 20%. From there we move on to the class of Mage, which are getting primarily PvP changes, starting with a spec of Arcane, which has been doing some wild numbers. The new talent for them, which is called Nether Flux, is being nerfed. Normally Nether Flux replaces Touch of the Magi for like a sort of CD version, but like a more potent version of Touch of the Magi that allows you for mini bursts every so often, increasing the damage of your next spell on a target by 100%, though amped up a little bit more with improved Touch of the Magi, which takes that number up by 25% more. They're reducing the base value of Nether Flux from 100% damage increase down to 40%. Now, I guess together with improved Touch of the Magi, together you're actually looking at about like a 65% damage amp, so it's still decent, but they definitely are reducing the overall output of this ability by quite a solid bit. For Fire Mages within PvP content, they're reducing the overall damage of Meteor, as its direct damage is being reduced by 40%. They've recently made it so that Meteor itself can deal 40% more damage to any target closest to impact, so closest to the center, but if you're just hitting one target, that means it gets full value, so it looks like they're basically counteracting that damage amp from Meteor directly. And finally we have the spec of Frost Mage, which are just getting a raw 10% damage reduction for PvP content in general. Next we have the class of Monk, with primarily changes for Brewmaster, primarily focusing on the Shadowpan tier set as well as the Shadowpan playstyle. As part of the tier set, they're doing a couple of reductions. Like in the 2 set, they're actually reducing the amount of bonus damage Flurry Strikes would deal, reducing it from 20% down to 10%. With the 4 set, they're actually reducing the Flurry Charge generation down from 50% down to 30%. Which generally means that you're going to be able to get less Flurry Strikes and less potent Flurry Strike procs during your major cooldowns, for Brewmaster specifically being Weapons of Order. However, they're taking a step further with the Shadowpan playstyle of the Flurry Strikes, and how Wisdom of the Wall can actually buff up the damage of and how the Capstone of Wisdom of the Wall, one of the buffs of it, one of the 4, can buff up the damage of Flurry Strikes directly. That damage amplification from Wisdom of the Wall is being reduced by 20%. I think this is because Brewmasters found themselves in a situation where once they used Weapons of Order, they were basically trying to spend as much energy as possible in order to proc as many Flurry Strikes as they could with the current tier set, which meant you just spamming abilities such as Keck Smash as well as Tiger Palm as regularly as possible, just trying to get as many procs of Flurry Strikes back to back to back, which created a little bit more of this degen playstyle where you're ignoring a portion of your base mechanics and are just trying to spend your energy as quickly as possible in the opener, just spamming it without necessarily a regard for any kind of other class mechanics whatsoever. So I think that's what they're trying to tone down, but also trying to create an opportunity where Master of Harmony can also be a little bit more competitive against Shadowpan in this brand new tier set. From there we move on to the class of Paladin, which is primarily getting PvP changes, starting with the spec of Holy, where they're actually reducing all healing of this spec by 12% in PvP. Just a raw healing reduction all across the board. However, they are also buffing the talent of Divine Plea, increasing its duration to 30 seconds up from 20 seconds originally. Then we move on to the class of Priest, which is also getting primarily PvP changes, specifically for the spec of Shadow, and even more specifically for the ability of Void Volley, which is a skill that activates after you finish channeling your Void Torrent, or after you activate Void Torrent, you technically can cancel it in order to cast it, which Archon Priests apparently are doing. Void Volley does a significant bit of damage, so they're reducing that damage by 30% within PvP, I think to reduce some of the burst potential of a Shadow Priest within PvP content. From there we move on to the class of Rogue, which is also going to get mostly PvP changes, specifically with a focus on Assassination Rogue. They're actually reducing the damage of your Garrote by 15%. there's a number of talents that can actually amplify the value of Garrote, cause them to deal additional damage, cause them to generate additional combo points, and with the talent of Indiscriminate Carnage, Garrotes can actually cleave to multiple targets. So if the blade does too much damage and you can easily cleave it across an entire team, that can allow them to exert some insane pressure. It also should be added that Garrote is fairly strong when it comes to silencing targets as well, so it kind of becomes this all-in-one button that just deals a ton of damage, and that is something it looks like they're trying to monitor. From there, we'll move on to the class of Shaman, where we're seeing Enhancement Shaman getting buffed up actually all across the board. Abilities like Lava Lash are receiving a 50% damage buff, while Wind Strike, which is available during Ascendance, receives a 20% damage buff. They also buffed up various elements of Totemic Shaman, such as buffing up its Surging Bolt damage by 25%, as well as the Searing Bolt damage by 35%. As well as buffing Stormbringer Capstone of Awakening Storm's damage effect by 35% as well. From there, we got the class of Warlock, which has gotten probably the weirdest set of buffs. First of all, the Voidwalker pet as well as your Felguard pet, whenever they have a certain buff active called Threatening Presence, it amplifies their aggro to all nearby enemies and increases the threat generation, making it easier for them to tank certain mobs. They're actually buffed up the Threatening Presence from a 400% aggro generation to a 950% increase aggro generation. So both Voidwalker and Felguard should be a little bit better at holding aggro. I believe probably is for solo content such as delves or even open world content. But outside of this niche buff for threat, they actually did end up giving them one more set of changes for PvP specifically, mostly targeting the spec of Demonology, nerfed its damage by 5% within PvP all across the board. And the final set of class changes will have to do with the class of Warrior, specifically focusing on Protection Warrior and the Mountain Thane tier set interaction. As part of the tier set, you're essentially going to be able to get more Thundering Blasts, and Thundering Blasts have a chance to call down Ionizing Strikes. Ionizing Strikes proc Thunderous Blast, Thunderous Blast can proc Ionizing Strikes, and gives you a good gameplay loop where you're dealing a ton of extra nature damage. Well, the damage of those Ionizing Strikes for Protection Warrior specifically is being reduced by 30%, so slightly less overall nature damage all across the board. So with that being said, as always, I do want to thank all of you guys so much for watching, and hope you guys did enjoy the video. If you did enjoy it or found it informative, go ahead and give this video a like. I would very much appreciate it. Also join our Discord community in case you just want to be kept up with anything new happening within the patch 11.2. Community dives into topics pretty regularly as soon as they happen. Also, let me know your thoughts in the comments down below, and as always, I'll see all of you guys in the next one.